The wind carried dust across the parade ground of Fort Mercy, and Clara Hayes pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The West was nothing like Boston. Back home, she had walked on cobbled streets shaded by oaks. Here, the sun was merciless. The earth cracked and stubborn, and the air seemed to hold the sharp tang of fear. She had been at the fort only a week, and already she wondered if she'd made a mistake coming west. The officers had requested a nurse, someone with proper training, someone who could keep wounds clean and fevers low when surgeons were too few and soldiers too many. Clara had answered, eager to prove her independence, eager to escape the quiet grief of her old life. But she had not expected this, a place where hostility seemed to hum in every corner, where the walls were less about defense and more about imprisonment. The commandant summoned her that morning. She entered his office, spine stiff, determined not to show nerves. He was a broad man with a jaw set like granite, and when he spoke, it was without ceremony. "You've done good work with our men," he said, eyes scanning a paper on his desk rather than her face. "Now you'll tend to the prisoner." Clara blinked. "The prisoner, sir?" He set down the paper and met her eyes. "The Apache. They call him Black Hawk. He was brought in last night after the skirmish by the river. Half our men wouldn't be breathing if not for the lucky shot that brought him down. Fierce as they come." Her heart quickened. She had heard the soldiers whisper his name in the barracks, the way children whispered of ghosts. Black Hawk was a shadow on the plains, a rider who struck swift and vanished into the canyons. To many here, he was more legend than man. "I'll do what I can," Clara said carefully, though she felt as though the ground beneath her shifted. "You'll do more than that. The men won't touch him. He won't let them. He's already bloodied one corporal who tried to clean his wounds. But he can't be left to rot. If he dies, we'll have more Apaches at our walls than we can handle. So it falls to you." Clara tried to steady her breath. "Sir, surely someone—" "No." His tone cut her short. "You're ordered. You'll wash him, dress his wounds, and keep him alive. Understand this, Miss Hayes. He's dangerous, even bound. But you've the softest hands in this fort. Maybe he'll let you close enough." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. To refuse would mark her as coward. Worse, it might send her back east in disgrace. Her attempt at a new life branded a failure. Guard who escorted her to the prisoner's tent was less reassuring. "Best keep your wits, miss." He looks at a person like he's measuring where to strike. The tent stood apart from the barracks, canvas flapping in the restless wind. The guard lifted the flap and Clara stepped inside. The air was close, thick, with the smell of blood, leather, and sweat. And there he was. Black Hawk sat upright despite the heavy chains at his wrists and ankles. His skin, bronzed and streaked with dirt, gleamed with sweat. A gash ran along his shoulder, half crusted, half bleeding anew. His hair, black as midnight, fell in loose tangles over his chest. But it was his eyes that struck her hardest, dark, unwavering, proud. He did not speak. He did not bow his head. He simply looked at her, and in that gaze Clara felt the weight of something immense, defiance, strength, and a refusal to be diminished. Her hand trembled around the basin she carried. She had been ordered to bathe him, to tend the fiercest Apache the fort had ever captured. And as she stood in that charged silence, Clara Hayes realized this was not merely an assignment. This was the beginning of something that could unmake her. The basin of water felt heavier than it should as Clara set it on the wooden stool beside the cot. She tried not to show her unease, but every nerve in her body was aware of him. This man they called Black Hawk. He sat with the rigid stillness of a wild creature cornered, eyes unblinking, his bound hands resting on his knees as though the chains were beneath his notice. Clara had tended men in pain before, soldiers raving with fever, boys missing limbs, old veterans coughing out their last breath, but none of them had ever unnerved her like this silent figure. He seemed less wounded than watchful, less prisoner than predator biding his time. She wet a cloth and wrung it out with careful fingers. "I'm here to clean the wound," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If it's not seen to, infection will set in." He didn't answer. His gaze traveled from her face to her hands and back again. It wasn't the look of a man cowed by chains. It was the steady measuring of someone who could read more in silence than most men could in words. Clara drew a slow breath. "I'll not harm you. I'm a nurse, not a soldier." Still nothing. But when she moved closer, lifting the cloth toward his shoulder, his muscles tensed like drawn bowstrings. She hesitated, then pressed the damp linen gently against the gash. Blood welled, bright and hot. He flinched not from the pain, she realized, but from the touch. His eyes flashed, sharp as flint, but he did not strike or jerk away. "Good," she whispered more to herself than to him. "That's good." She worked carefully, wiping away the crusted blood, cooling the angry skin. Every motion felt amplified in the silence. She became acutely aware of the steady rhythm of his breath, of the faint scent of earth and smoke clinging to his skin, of the scars that told stories she could only imagine, slashes, burns, and faint pale marks that spoke of years of battles and hardships. When she reached for the salve, his voice came low, rough, startling. "No." Clara froze. The small tin in her hand. It was the first word he had spoken, and though his accent bent the English hard, the refusal was clear. "It will keep the wound from festering," she explained. "I've seen too many men lose arms or lives because they thought they could heal without it." His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would turn away. But then, with the slightest incline of his head, he permitted it. Clara dabbed the ointment gently. His skin burned with fever warmth, but he endured it in silence. She had expected curses, resistance, perhaps even a struggle. Instead, he bore the pain with a stoicism that humbled her. When she tied the bandage in place, her fingers brushed against his chest, and she drew back quickly, heat rising to her face. She reminded herself sternly that this was no different than tending any other patient. Yet she could not shake the awareness of him, his nearness, his strength even in chains. The guard outside shifted his weight, clearing his throat. Clara glanced toward the flap of the tent, then back at her patient. "They think you're less than human," she said quietly, almost without meaning to. "But I see a man. And men deserve care." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, not gratitude, not softness, but recognition. As if he heard in her words a truth he had long known but rarely found echoed. He said nothing more. When she finished, she packed away her cloths and rose to leave. Yet as she reached the tent's edge, she turned once more. He was still watching her, steady, unyielding. Clara stepped into the sunlit yard, her heart hammering. She had survived her first tending of the fiercest Apache, but she knew this was only the beginning. Something had passed between them in that silent exchange, something unspoken, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Clara had thought the first tending was the worst of it. She had been wrong. When the order came, it was spoken in the same matter-of-fact tone the commandant might have used to request the floor swept or the horses watered. "The prisoner stinks of blood and dirt," he declared. "See that he's washed." "You'll do it." Clara opened her mouth, then closed it again. She could argue all she wished, but it would make no difference. She was not here to be heard, only obeyed. Still, the words rattled in her head as she carried a bucket of steaming water toward the isolated tent. "You'll do it." Inside, the air was close, heavy with the mingled scents of sweat and iron. Black Hawk sat on the cot, wrists and ankles bound, back straight as a lance. He looked at her as if he had already measured her courage and found it wanting. "I'm ordered to see you washed." Clara said softly, setting down the bucket and cloths. She kept her tone even, professional. It will sting less if the dirt is gone. For a long, taut moment, he did not move. Then, to her astonishment, he gave a single, curt nod. Her hands trembled as she wrung out a cloth. She began with his arms, wiping away the dried blood that clung to his skin. His flesh was warm beneath her touch, corded with muscle that spoke. Of strength born not in gins or drills, but in the relentless trials of wilderness. Each time her fingers brushed too near the raw edge of a wound, his jaw tightened. He made no sound. Clara could not help but admire his control. She had seen grown men howl like children for far lesser hurts. When she moved to his chest, she faltered. The intimacy of it startled her, and she reminded herself sternly that this was a duty, nothing more. Yet her pulse betrayed her. She dabbed at the grime, careful not to linger, though every stroke seemed to press her deeper, into a silence charged with something neither of them could name. Her cloth traced over scars, some thin as threads, others jagged as lightning. "You've suffered much," she murmured before she could stop herself. His eyes flicked to hers. For the briefest heartbeat, she thought he might answer. But he only studied her, gaze unreadable, as though weighing her soul against the words. She had spoken. Clara swallowed, shifted to his shoulders, then down the length of his arm. She had to steady her breath, for the task was growing harder. Not because of fear, but because she felt too aware of him, the warmth of his skin, the quiet power coiled beneath the surface, the dignity that no chain could strip. At last she came to his back. She hesitated, then motioned for him to turn. He did, slow and deliberate, as though granting a favor. Her breath caught. His back was a map of pain. Long welts, faded lashes, scars that told of battles, punishments, survival against cruelty she could scarcely imagine. No one at the fort had seen this, not the officers who barked commands, nor the guards who spat the word savage. Only her. For the first time, she felt shame that she had thought of him only as an enemy, shame that others spoke of him as less than human. The truth was written in scars across his body. He had endured, he had fought, he had lived. Her hand hovered, then gently pressed the cloth to his skin. He tensed, but did not pull away. She worked in silence, her heart aching in a way she had not expected. When she finished, she set the cloth aside, her throat dry. She wanted to speak, to say she was sorry, or that she understood, or that she admired his strength, but no words seemed right. Instead, she met his gaze once more. In his eyes, she saw something that startled her. Not gratitude, not trust, but the faintest flicker of curiosity. As if he, too, wondered at her. Clara gathered her things quickly, for her composure was slipping. She stepped into the sharp sunlight beyond the tent, the echo of his gaze following her. She had been ordered to bathe him. She had obeyed. But in the process, she had seen what no other eyes at Fort Mercy had ever dared: the truth of the man they called the fiercest Apache. The days that followed were a study in silence. Clara returned to the prisoner's tent each morning, carrying bandages, ointments, and the cautious hope that Black Hawk might permit her presence without confrontation. At first, he had looked at her with the same cold defiance, as if daring her to falter, daring her to betray weakness. But over time, she began to notice subtle changes, small signals that spoke louder than words. He no longer flinched when she approached. When she knelt beside him to clean a wound, his shoulders relaxed just a fraction, the tension in his neck easing ever so slightly. He allowed her to touch his hands without clenching his fists. He even shifted in his cot, offering her better access, not with obedience, but with acknowledgement of her skill. It was the first sign of respect, and it unsettled her as much as it thrilled her. She had never felt such weight in a glance before, nor such deliberate measurement of her actions. Clara realized he watched her as a man might observe a worthy adversary, keen, deliberate, assessing, learning. One afternoon, the tent was suffused with the golden light of the setting sun. Clara knelt beside him, cleaning the scab along his arm. The cloth was damp, warm, scented faintly of soap and herbs. She worked in silence as always, but today something shifted. Black Hawk's eyes, dark and sharp, followed each motion of her hand. Then, without warning, he spoke not in the clipped, rough English of the fort, but in a slow, deliberate murmur. "Careful," he said, voice like gravel over silk. "Not too hard." Clara froze, heart hammering. He had spoken to her. Not. A demand, not a threat, but a warning, a request. Her lips parted, but she managed only, "I won't hurt you." He studied her, and then, for the first time, a trace of something like amusement flickered across his face, a brief, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving the stoic mask once more, but it was enough. Enough to tell Clara that she had crossed some invisible barrier, enough to hint that he recognized her as a person capable of skill, care, and discretion. From that moment, the rhythm of their interactions began to change. Black Hawk allowed her greater freedom, subtle trust woven into the way he moved, how he held himself. He did not soften completely. He was still the formidable warrior the fort feared, but she began to sense a mutual understanding. One morning, as Clara cleaned his wounds, a soldier passed the tent, calling out a crude remark meant to mock her. Normally, she would have ignored it, but today she glanced at Black Hawk. He did not raise his voice, nor did he flinch, yet the tilt of his head, the sharp glance, spoke volumes. Clara felt something protective in that look, as if he silently challenged anyone who would belittle her. It stunned her. It was dangerous, this bond that grew without words. Clara had been trained to care for the sick and wounded, but she had never been prepared for the feeling that rose in her chest when she met his gaze. It was not fear, though that lingered. It was respect, mingled with something warmer. Something that refused to be named. She caught herself thinking about him when she was away from the tent, remembering the flash of dark eyes under thick lashes, the way his chest rose and fell in silent strength, the quiet dignity he carried even in chains. For the first time, she understood why the soldiers whispered his name in awe and dread. He was fierce, yes, but also a man of principle, unbroken by circumstance. A force of nature no one could tame, and she, of all people, had been allowed to see him as he truly was. As the sun sank below the horizon, Clara gathered her supplies, her mind swirling with the awareness that their connection, fragile and dangerous as it was, had begun to take root. He had shown her respect in a world where she had expected only fear and violence. And in return, she found herself drawn to him in ways she did not yet understand. In that quiet, fading light, she realized that nothing in the fort, no order, no command, could undo the subtle bond forming between them. And though she did not yet know the shape it would take, she felt the first stirrings of a truth that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. Black Hawk, the fiercest Apache in the West, had allowed her to see him, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had begun to see her as well. The rhythm of their daily encounters settled into something neither Clara nor Black Hawk could fully name. Words were few, but each gesture, each glance, carried weight heavier than any spoken sentence. It was a connection forged in silence, trust earned in small increments, and the shared vulnerability of bodies and minds laid bare by circumstance. Clara began to anticipate his reactions. The slight tightening of his jaw when a bandage tugged too harshly, the subtle lift of an eyebrow when she approached too hastily. He, in turn, seemed to gauge her steadiness, testing whether her hands would falter, whether her eyes would betray hesitation. Neither spoke of the tension that buzzed between them like a storm waiting to break, but both felt it, and it bound them in ways neither could yet name. One evening, the sun dipping behind the distant mesas, Clara found herself kneeling beside him, carefully cleaning a fresh abrasion along his forearm. The camp outside was quiet, the soldiers long since retired, leaving only the soft hiss of the wind through the tent flap. "You work carefully," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. The words felt like a breach of some invisible wall, a recognition that had not been voiced before. Clara froze, cloth poised over the wound. I do my duty," she murmured, aware of her own pulse thrumming in her ears. He made no reply, but his eyes lingered on hers longer than usual. Something unspoken passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the boundaries they were both bending without admitting it. Clara realized she looked forward to these moments, to the quiet intimacy of tending him, to the tension and respect that danced just beneath the surface. At times, her hands would brush against his skin, accidental or intentional, it did not matter. Each touch left a trail of awareness, a spark that neither dared name. And yet, there was no fear in his gaze, only a measured acceptance, a silent agreement that this strange closeness would not harm either of them so long as it remained. Unspoken. Clara began to notice more than the obvious scars and injuries. The tilt of his shoulders, the way his fingers flexed around the chains, the subtle way he held himself even in restraint, it all spoke of a life honed by hardship and survival. And she, in turn, began to show signs of her own heart softening, her defenses lowering, her admiration deepening into something far more tender than she expected. One morning, as she adjusted a bandage across his chest, he shifted slightly, his hand brushing against hers. A spark ran through her at the contact, and she caught herself holding her breath. He did not pull away. He did not speak. But the gesture carried a message louder than words could convey, a trust, a recognition that what existed between them was delicate, dangerous, and real. Outside, the fort continued its relentless rhythm of commands, drills, and gossip. Soldiers whispered of Black Hawk's capture, of his fierceness, of the impossibility of taming him. But in the tent, time moved differently. Here, they existed in a world defined by shared care, unspoken acknowledgement, and a growing intimacy that neither dared articulate. Clara realized that in every glance, every touch, every silent exchange, they were speaking a language that the fort could never understand. A language built on respect, endurance, and the recognition of each other as more than soldier and captive. The unspoken connection weighed on her both, sweetly and painfully. She felt it in her chest, a persistent awareness that grew with each visit, each cleaning of wounds, each careful touch. She wondered if he felt it too, or if, like her, he simply allowed the moment to exist without naming it, for fear of what acknowledging it might bring. And yet, there was no denying it. In the quiet, intimate spaces of that small tent, Clara, Hayes and Black Hawk had begun to understand one another in ways no orders, no chains, and no fear could prevent. They were bound by something far stronger than circumstance, something that whispered of trust, recognition, and the faintest glimmer of what might one day become something deeper. As she packed her supplies that evening, she cast one last glance at him. His gaze met hers, steady, unwavering, and something unspoken passed between them. Neither of them needed words to acknowledge the truth. In the silence, in the touch, in the careful tending of wounds, a connection had formed that neither duty nor fear could undo. It was dangerous, it was fragile, and it was beginning to grow. Days turned into a rhythm neither Clara nor Black Hawk had anticipated. Every morning, she returned to the tent with her supplies, and every day, the silence between them seemed less like tension and more like an unspoken understanding. She had begun to see beyond the walls he built, Glimpsing the man beneath the legend of the fiercest Apache in the West. It began one quiet afternoon. The sun poured gold through the canvas, warming the small space, and Clara knelt beside him, cleaning a particularly stubborn abrasion along his side. She moved carefully, mindful of his reactions, when he suddenly spoke. "You see?" "Scars," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of observation rather than complaint. "Yes," Clara replied softly. "I see what they tell me. They tell a story?" His eyes flicked to hers, dark and unreadable. Then, for the first time, he began to speak not about the fort, not about the soldiers, but about himself. He told her in halting English about life on the plains, of families lost to raids, of villages burned and rebuilt, of winters that had tested the strength of even the hardiest men. Each story was a fragment, a glimpse into a world far harsher than she had imagined. Clara listened, her hands never ceasing their careful work. She felt her chest tighten as she realized the depth of what he had endured. Every scar she had cleaned, every line she had traced with gentle fingers, was a testament not only to survival but to endurance, courage, and an unyielding spirit. "You fight. Not only soldiers," he said quietly, "but the land, the cold, hunger, always survive." She nodded. "You've lived more in your years than most men do in a lifetime." For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle rustle of the cloth and the distant calls of soldiers training outside. Clara understood that he was measuring her response, testing whether she would recoil in horror, pity, or disdain. But she only offered quiet acknowledgment, her eyes meeting his, steady and sincere. Over the following days his stories grew. He spoke of nights spent beneath stars too bright to ignore, of rivers that carried both sustenance and danger, of kin and friendships forged and lost. He spoke not to seek sympathy, but simply to let her know the man he was a man of courage, of memory, of depth that could not be captured by fear or rumor. Clara found herself sharing fragments of her own life in return, though carefully, cautiously. She spoke of her family in Boston, of the grief that had driven her west, and of her hope to find purpose in a land as raw and unforgiving as the man before her. Each revelation, small as it seemed, built trust, brick by brick, between them. Tent, once a place of tension and duty, became a sanctuary. Here, stripped of pretense and fear, they could glimpse each other's humanity. Black Hawk, fierce and unyielding to the world, revealed vulnerability only to her. And Clara, trained in medicine and duty, discovered a heart capable of empathy, admiration, and though she did not yet name it, desire. One evening, as she carefully cleaned a scar along his forearm, he paused and looked at her, the fading sunlight catching the planes of his face. "You see me, not savage, not enemy, see man." Her heart ached with the simplicity and power of the statement. "I see you," she whispered, "and I always will." For a moment, the air between them seemed to shimmer, charged with the weight of unspoken truths and nascent feelings. It was a fragile moment, one that could not yet be named, yet its presence was undeniable. They were no longer just nurse and prisoner, soldier and captive. They were two souls beginning to understand, to respect, and perhaps, unknowingly, to care. As Clara packed her supplies that night, she realized that every scar she had touched, every story he had shared, had changed her. She no longer saw Black Hawk as merely the fiercest Apache or a dangerous prisoner. She saw him as a man, fully and irreducibly, a man whose strength and vulnerability had captured her attention, and whose trust she had begun to earn. And in that quiet, dimly lit tent, amidst the shadows and the lingering scent of herbs and sweat, Clara Hayes understood that their connection had deepened beyond respect. It had moved into the territory of something far more intimate, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than either of them could yet admit. Clara's quiet days at the tent were no longer hers alone. Each visit, each careful touch of cloth to skin, each shared glance carried weight far beyond the medical task at hand. She had begun to care for Black Hawk in ways she could scarcely admit, even to herself. And with that care came a gnawing tension she had not anticipated. The conflict between her duty to the fort and the loyalty her heart now felt toward the man before her. It began subtly, in small ways. Soldiers would pass the tent flap, making crude remarks or whispering of the savage in tones meant to belittle. She had once ignored such things, but now the words struck her like blows. She noticed Black Hawk's steady gaze when they passed, a quiet warning in the tilt of his head, the narrowing of his eyes. She could feel the unspoken understanding between them. He trusted her to see him as a man, and she could not betray that trust without tearing a part of herself in the process. The commandant, oblivious to the bond forming in the tent, called her one morning. "Miss Hayes," he said, tone brisk and clipped, "your care for the prisoner is sufficient. But do not forget your duty. You are here to serve the fort, not to indulge sentiment." Her hands, which had been steady for weeks, trembled slightly. "Yes, sir," she replied, forcing a smile. Yet, as she left his office, she could feel the weight of his warning pressing on her chest. Duty, she knew, was the law of the fort. Compassion, real, human compassion, was something no one else would understand. And her compassion was no longer abstract. It had a face, a presence, a life. Back in the tent, Black Hawk watched her as she entered. There was no reproach in his eyes, only that same silent appraisal that had become their shared language. But Clara could feel the danger of her feelings, the precariousness of the trust they had built. One misstep, one hint of attachment, and both of them would pay a price far greater than bruises or scorn. She busied herself with bandages and salves, refusing to meet his gaze for longer than necessary. Yet he sensed her tension, and for the first time he spoke more freely. "You care," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Not for duty. Care beyond what expected." Her fingers stilled. She could not deny it. I do," she whispered, almost to herself. "I care because it's right, because I see you as you are." His gaze softened, just slightly, as if acknowledging a fragile truth too dangerous to voice. "Then trust dangerous," he murmured. "You risk your place, your people." Clara swallowed, the weight of reality pressing on her. The fort depended on obedience. She was expected to see him as enemy, as prisoner, as something to be subdued. Yet her heart had betrayed her. She could not see him that way. And the knowledge of that betrayal, even if it was moral rather than overt, made her feel exposed, vulnerable, and alive in ways she had never expected in the harsh Western Plains. Days passed, each visit fraught with this tension. Clara struggled to reconcile her loyalty to the fort with the bond she had formed. Each wound she tended, each scar she cleaned, strengthened that connection, but also deepened the peril. Soldiers would notice small delays in her work, subtle softness in her voice, lingering glances that were meant for no one but him. Rumors could begin here, and suspicion could mean dismissal or worse. Yet for all the risk, Clara could not retreat. She had glimpsed the man beneath the legend, and she had seen trust offered to her in a way no one else had ever been allowed. To walk away now would not only break that trust, but also betray the very part of herself that had drawn west in search of purpose and meaning. As she packed her supplies one evening, Clara lingered at the tent flap, casting a glance at him. Black Hawk's dark eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, and for a fleeting moment they shared an understanding that words could not hold. Duty demanded one thing, but the heart sometimes demanded another. In the quiet of the approaching night, Clara Hayes realized that she was no longer merely a nurse performing an assignment. She was a woman caught between two worlds, two loyalties, and two lives, one bound by the fort's orders, the other bound by something far more intimate and dangerous. And in the tension of that choice, she felt alive, terrified, and powerless to turn away. The night air was thick with dust and the scent of sagebrush as Clara moved quietly through the fort, careful to avoid the patrols. Her heart hammered not from exertion, but from the dangerous knowledge she carried. Black Hawk, the fiercest Apache in the West, was to be transferred at first light. The commandant had grown impatient, and orders were clear. He was to be shackled, moved to a more secure prison farther west, and likely left to rot where no one could intervene. Clara's hand shook as she gathered supplies, bandages, a small satchel of food, and the water she had carefully carried for weeks. She had made her decision in silence, weighing duty against her heart. The fort demanded obedience, loyalty, and caution, but the man she had come to know, to respect, and to care for, deserved more than chains. And she could not let him be destroyed. She approached the prisoner's tent, her footsteps muffled against the packed dirt. Inside, Black Hawk sat upright, alert even in the dim moonlight filtering through the canvas. His dark eyes met hers immediately, sharp and piercing, and she saw the understanding there, the awareness that something was about to change. That trust would now demand action. "They'll move you at dawn," Clara whispered. I can't let them, not like this." He said nothing, only tilted his head as if weighing her words. His hand flexed around the chains at his wrist, and Clara realized that this silent gesture was consent, or at least acknowledgement. He trusted her enough to act. Her fingers worked quickly, loosening the ropes that bound him. Each knot she untied felt like a small rebellion against the world outside. When the last chain fell away, Black Hawk stood, tall and unflinching, muscles coiled like steel springs. He made no sudden move, no strike. Instead, he simply regarded her, the quietest question in his gaze. "Now what?" Clara swallowed and met his eyes. "We leave now, before anyone notices." Without hesitation, he followed her lead, moving as silently as a shadow. They slipped through the fort under the cover of darkness, keeping to alleys and shadowed corners, avoiding the lanterns and the soldiers' patrols. Every step was dangerous, every breath measured. Clara could feel the weight of fear and exhilaration coiled tightly within her chest. Once outside the fort, the world opened up in a way she had never known. The plains stretched endlessly, bathed in moonlight, silent except for the distant cry of coyotes. Black Hawk moved with certainty, a creature of the land, every step measured, every instinct honed for survival. Clara followed, awed and terrified, relying on his guidance to navigate the darkness. Hours passed as they moved, the fort shrinking behind them, until at last they reached a small creek hidden among scrub and boulders. Black Hawk paused, turning to her, and in the faint glow of the moon, she saw something raw and vulnerable beneath his fierceness. Trust offered without question. "You chose this," he said, voice low but steady. Clara met his gaze, feeling the truth of it in her bones. "I chose you," she whispered, "because no one else will see you as I do." For the first time, words bridged the silence that had defined them. In that moment, the enormity of what they had done, what she had risked, pressed down on her, but it was tempered by the clarity of purpose and the intimacy of shared resolve. They were no longer nurse and prisoner, captor and captive. They were partners in defiance, allies in a world that would not understand, and two hearts beating in unison under the same moonlit sky. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting the plains in gold and shadow, Clara realized the truth. She could no longer deny. She had left the safety of the fort, the security of duty, and everything she had known behind. For him, for them. And in that choice, terrifying and irrevocable, she found a strange and fierce exhilaration. Black Hawk did not speak again, but his hand brushed against hers, a silent acknowledgment of trust, respect, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Together they disappeared into the vast, untamed wilderness, two figures bound by danger, courage, and a love that dared to exist where no one else could see it. The world beyond the fort was vast, untamed, and merciless. Clara quickly learned that the survival she had once imagined careful tending of wounds, predictable routines was nothing compared to navigating the wild alongside Black Hawk. Plains stretched endlessly, dotted with scrub, mesas, and the occasional stand of trees that offered brief shelter from the relentless sun. At first, Clara's fear was constant. Each rustle of the wind, each distant coyote cry, reminded her that one misstep could spell disaster. But Black Hawk was steady, a force as sure and unyielding as the land itself. He moved with ease, guided by instincts born of years on the plains, teaching her to observe the signs of the wild, which plants could nourish, where water lay hidden, how to travel without leaving a trace. In those shared trials, something deeper began to form. The bond between them, once defined by the tension of duty and defiance, became intimate in a way that neither words nor gestures could fully capture. Clara's hands brushed against his as they gathered firewood. Their shared warmth beside the flickering flames of the campfire carried a quiet electricity. Each glance, each unspoken touch, conveyed emotions far beyond simple trust or necessity. One evening, after a long day of travel through rocky terrain, Black Hawk finally spoke in the language of their silence. They had made camp beside a small, hidden creek, the water whispering over smooth stones. Clara tended the minor cuts she had accumulated, but her mind kept returning to him, to the strength in his presence, to the gentleness he had shown when no one else could see. "You are different here," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "Not in Fort. Out here, see who you are. Fear? Gone?" Clara paused, water dripping from her hands. "Not gone," she admitted. "But it feels smaller, less consuming. Because you are here." He regarded her quietly, and then, in a moment that took her breath, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was simple, yet electric, carrying more intimacy than words ever could. She felt her heart catch, a flutter of something both terrifying and exhilarating. The days passed, and their closeness deepened. They shared stories and whispers beneath starlit skies, each revelation weaving them closer together. Clara spoke. Of Boston, of the family she had left behind, and of the grief that had driven her west. Black Hawk spoke of his people, of rivers and valleys, of winters endured and friends lost. Their words became confessions, a private world built from shared trust and vulnerability. Even in silence, their connection was undeniable. Each night, they slept near the fire, the comfort of each other's presence more potent than warmth or protection. Each day, they moved as a unit through the wilderness, relying on one another for survival, yet also for the quiet sustenance of companionship. Clara began to understand the depth of her feelings. She admired his strength, his courage, the unflinching dignity with which he faced a world that sought to destroy him. And in moments when his gaze met hers, steady and unwavering, she felt the stirrings of love intense, wild, and undeniable. Black Hawk, too, revealed subtle signs of affection. Small gestures, almost imperceptible, betrayed the depth of his regard. An unguarded glance, a hand brushing hers in passing, the way he always ensured she took the safest path, the warmest fire, the best shelter. In the wilderness, where survival demanded vigilance and cunning, he had chosen to protect her in ways that transcended necessity. By the time they paused atop a ridge overlooking the endless plains below, Clara realized they were no longer just two fugitives navigating danger. They were companions in the truest sense, bound by trust, shared hardship, and the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something powerful had taken root between them. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Clara felt the full weight of what had blossomed in the wilderness. Love, fierce and undeniable, born not in comfort or safety, but in the raw, unyielding expanse of the untamed West. And for the first time in her life, she embraced it not as fear, not as duty, but as something sacred, something wild and entirely her own. The morning sun painted the plains in shades of amber and gold, illuminating the path that Clara and Black Hawk had carved together. Behind them lay the fort, a place of orders, suspicion, and danger. Ahead lay the wilderness untamed, unpredictable, but free. It was here, in the open expanse of the West, that Clara realized they could finally be themselves without fear, without judgment, and without the chains of duty or expectation. They had traveled for days, surviving by wits, instinct, and an unspoken rhythm that had grown between them. Each step deepened their bond, each night beneath the stars brought them closer, and each shared hardship became a thread in the tapestry of a life they were weaving together. Clara had grown strong in ways she had never imagined, and Black Hawk's presence was no longer merely protective, it was companionship, love, and the quiet assurance of trust. One afternoon they came upon a small valley, sheltered by ridges and dotted with trees, where a creek ran clear and steady. It was untouched, a secret haven far from prying eyes and the reach of soldiers. Black Hawk paused, scanning the land with eyes that saw more than terrain. He saw potential, safety, and permanence. Clara followed his gaze, her heart swelling with hope. "This, here," he said simply. His voice was low, gravelly, but softened by a rare hint of warmth. "Safe. For now? For you? For us?" Clara nodded, tears prickling her eyes. She had never imagined that freedom could feel so full, so alive. She stepped closer, letting her hand brush against his. "We can build here," she said. "A place to live, to be together. Beyond the fort, beyond everything that tried to keep us apart." He regarded her silently for a moment. Then, in a gesture as deliberate as it was tender, he took her hand in his, entwining their fingers. In that touch, Clara felt the weight of the journey they had shared, the dangers, the escapes, the nights spent trusting one another completely, and the promise of what was to come. They began to make a home among the trees and creek, simple but sufficient. Black Hawk showed her how to hunt, how to navigate the seasons, how to read the signs of nature that had kept his people alive for generations. Clara tended a small garden along the creek, planting herbs and vegetables she had learned could thrive in the soil. Each day was a balance of work and quiet companionship, survival and the deepening intimacy of shared life. Evenings were the sweetest. They would sit by the fire, hands occasionally brushing, eyes meeting in silent understanding. Words were unnecessary most of the time. Their presence was enough. In the quiet, Clara often reflected on how far they had come from the fear-laden tension of the fort to the trust, respect, and love that now defined their days. One night, under a sky thick with stars, Black Hawk spoke. "No fort, no orders, only us. You stayed, chose this, chose me." Clara leaned against him, feeling the strength in his arms, the warmth of his body, and the unspoken promise in his words. "I did," she whispered, "and I would choose it every time." For the first time, the weight of their past felt distant, replaced by the certainty of a future they would shape together. They were free not just from chains, from soldiers, or from the expectations of others, but free to define their lives, their love, and their place in a world that had once seemed so harsh and unyielding. Seasons changed. Crops grew, fires burned bright, and life settled into a rhythm that felt both wild and sacred. Clara and Black Hawk built more than a shelter, they built a life, a sanctuary where they could exist as equals, partners, and lovers. In the face of the vast wilderness, in the shadow of hardship and legend, they had carved out a world of their own making. And in that world, Clara Hayes and Black Hawk, the fiercest Apache, discovered the truth that had drawn them together from the beginning. Love, once found, was worth every risk, every defiance, and every leap into the unknown. Together, they faced the endless frontier not as nurse and prisoner, not as soldier and captive, but as two hearts bound by trust, courage, and the enduring power of love. The West stretched before them, wild and untamed. And for the first time, they were free to meet it as one.